Afternoon. My name is Chad Cunningham, and I am your Loss Control Director at Insurance Board. I would like to welcome you to this time of learning with our topic, Safe Conduct 2025, New Research and Best Practices. Before our speaker starts, there are a couple guidelines I would like to review with you. One, this webcast will be recorded and uploaded to the Insurance Board online training portion of the website for future viewing in about a week or so. You will receive an email with a document with the links. This slide deck will not be available for this webinar. We have turned off chat and we are doing questions and answers. So you can use the questions and answers and put your questions in there. We will answer them throughout what we can, and we will keep some towards the end. Our speaker is Christy Schiller, Vice President of Consulting. Christy has over 20 years of experience in applying social science and public health strategies to prevent abuse and its long-term effects. In her role at Presidium, Christy has developed customized solutions for complex organizations such as religious institutes and denominations, fraternal organizations, K-12 schools, and healthcare systems. She has worked with clients globally. Christy has also led content development for Presidium's Creating a Safe Environment or CASE training program and has helped develop many of Presidium's consultations. She is a former complex litigation research analyst with a bachelor's degree in anthropology and a master's in medical anthropology. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Christy Schiller.
Good afternoon. My name is Christy Schiller, and thank you for that introduction, Chad. Really excited to be here with everyone today. Thank you for the opportunity to work with Insurance Board the way that we have over the years. It's really an honor to partner with the Insurance Board in this way. Got a lot of information to share today about some of the latest research and best practices in safe conduct and working with your congregations. I hope you find this valuable. And we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'm actually going to go ahead and jump in. Okay. Just a little bit about who Presidium is, and some of you may already be familiar with us, but we really work exclusively with organizations that serve vulnerable populations, so children, youths, vulnerable adults, to prevent sexual abuse. And so our mission is to help you protect those in your care from abuse and to help preserve trust in your organization. And I think many of you will appreciate that that's more important than ever. And we want to make sure that we are bringing our experience to the table. We've got thousands of clients across a range of industries. So in addition to our work with faith-based organizations, we also work with secular schools, social service agencies, hospitals, universities, the full range of organizations that serve their community in many different ways. Our work is based on many years of research, and I'll show you our paradigm, if you will, in my next slide. But really, this comes back to understanding the root causes of how sexual abuse happens in these organizations. And that's to compare that to the differences with the dynamics of how abuse happens in the home. We're really looking at specifically how sexual abuse happens when people are in the care of others outside of the home. We do offer a full range of risk management solutions, and I promise I won't do a big infomercial. You can learn more on our website. But we really base everything in our safety equation. So I'll show you that in a second, but I do want to remind everyone, while we're really focusing on prevention and solutions, we are talking about a difficult topic. So please feel free, step away, take a break, because we know so many people have been affected by sexual abuse in their lives. So you'll see a lot of what I'm going to share today is anchored around what we call our safety equation. And if you've been to any training I've ever done for the Insurance Board, or that anyone from Presidium has ever done, we really want to give you this framework because we're talking about a very complex risk. Not to say that other risks aren't important or need this level of attention, but it's human behaviors that we're talking about, and relationships. And these are the kinds of things that can be subtle and over time turn into a big issue. And so we want to help organizations have checks and balances to prevent sexual abuse from happening. And the way that we approach this risk is, as with all things at Presidium, is we did a lot of research back when we got started in the late 80s, early 90s. And what we started looking into was, again, how abuse happens outside of the home. And our founder was on the board of a local youth serving organization that had a terrible incident in one of its after school programs. A volunteer abused a participant, a second grade boy, and they were absolutely devastated. And they appealed to him as a professor and as a clinical psychologist to help them understand what had happened. Where did the system fail this child? And so, being a good professor, he grabbed a couple of graduate students and they started doing research on this type of abuse. And back then, it's scary to say, 35 years ago now, because it was just not that long ago. I was in high school. We didn't really find much. There wasn't a lot in the literature, in the research about this. We were really starting to focus more on abuse in the home. And so the next logical place to kind of understand where a system can break down is looking at legal cases and understanding where organizations had exposures that led to this situation. And this was about the time we really started to see more organizations actually facing that type of liability. Boy Scouts, Boys and Girls Clubs of America, the Catholic Church even. And so what our research team found looking at that data set was there weren't thousands of different reasons why abuse happened in organizations, but there weren't just one or two. What they found was the exposures that organizations have really tend to cluster in these areas. And from that, we developed our safety equations. So we know that, having strong policies is a great way to safeguard, not only to help people understand what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, how to respond if there's an allegation, how to make sure everyone's on the same proverbial page when we talk about this issue. When you don't have those policies, it can be a huge exposure. And I know through the insurance board, you've got access to plenty of resources with that. But also screening and selection. And so this is an area that has evolved significantly over time. When we first started doing this work 30 plus years ago, a lot of organizations weren't doing any formal screening and selection. They may have done some minimal things with employees as part of just normal employment practices, but really screening folks for the risk for abuse is something that has evolved over time, and those standards continue to be raised throughout human services and faith-based industries.
Excuse me, Christy, I'm sorry to interrupt very quickly.
Please.
Can you reshare your screen? I think when we zoomed you from backstage to onstage, your
Let
screen
me.
decided
Okay.
not to come up with you.
It didn't come over with us. Okay.
No, it liked being backstage.
Now let's see if I can do that. I will. Thank you, Chad. I couldn't.
My pleasure.
How is that, my friend?
Yep, go ahead if you can select the
That one?
that one right there. Now
Okay.
we're rock and rolling.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you.
Let me get back to my safety equation. So talking about screening and selection and how those standards have evolved over time, likewise with training. And training is one of those areas that, a lot of organizations get. We've got to do training. Churches have access to resources. For the most part over the years, this has been focused on mandated reporting. So if you suspect abuse, what are your legal obligations in the state that you live in? Because those are very specific mandates. Now, we're seeing more and more states move toward every adult is a mandated reporter in their state. And what that really means is that as an individual adult, you are responsible for reporting firsthand suspicions of abuse. And there are laws to protect people who report in good faith. We know sometimes people may tap the brakes because they think, well, I saw reports in my state that our child protective services aren't that great. And I don't want to risk someone's livelihood and someone's parental rights if the state's not going to handle it well. We know that there are always going to be concerns like that, but it's your legal obligation to report, and it's important to work through those concerns. We're going to talk about reporting more in a bit. Monitoring and supervision. I'll share more data in a bit about actual exposures in this area, but this is where we tend to see the most claims when it comes to sexual abuse negligence. So effectively, when abuse happens, the first question is going to be, who was supposed to be supervising this person? Why was that person alone with my child? Where were the other adults in the room? Who else went on the youth retreat? This is where we tend to see a lot of legal action. And please know, I'm going to talk about that a little bit at the beginning, but our goal isn't how do we make sure that we're just protected legally. We're really genuinely trying to prevent the human tragedy of abuse and the harm that ripples through a community when abuse happens. But it's a very real part of managing this risk is understanding the financial and legal repercussions too. Internal feedback systems. So what mechanisms are in place to make sure that if there are concerns being raised, how are those getting managed? You know, how do folks communicate those concerns, and how do you minimize barriers that keep people from coming forward sooner rather than later? So people get, I'm a mandated reporter, it's straightforward. The harder thing, even than that, is to get people to realize, you know what, this just isn't sitting well with me. Rather than sit back and I'm just going to observe this for a little bit and see if it gets any worse. That is the moment we want people to come forward. We want to get in front of this sooner rather than later. Consumer participation. This is about how do you empower the people that you serve in ministry to know what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. If parents don't know that their youth minister is not supposed to be texting their child directly, they can't enforce that. So how do we bring youths and their families into the equation, literally, to make sure that they're part of that team and understand what the rules are? Because again, they're going to be likely to help with that if otherwise they wouldn't. Responding. So again, that full spectrum of responding to lower level concerns all the way through to suspicions of abuse. How a person that comes forward to report that they've been abused in your church is received is going to set the trajectory for that person's healing. It's going to set the trajectory for your church's liability. It is so precious to get responding correct. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And then your administrative practices. So how do you know that your like ministries are managed like? So how are you being consistent across all of your ministries? You may have special requirements with your camp if you're accredited by the American Camping Association. You may have special requirements for a preschool if you have a licensed preschool or day school. But how do you know at a minimum you've got minimum standards across all of your ministries so that everyone that you serve is going to be safe? So we'll talk more about some specific data around churches next. So at Presidium, we have a full research and analytics team. Again, we were born out of academia, so we value research and innovation as part of our work at Presidium. And they monitor not only the ongoing published academic peer-reviewed research that's happening, but also those cases, those legal cases, because we see trends in those as well. And so we have access to some pretty powerful databases that are constantly being added to, uploaded with new legal precedents, new legal cases. And so I just wanted to share some insights from an analysis that our research team did to prep for this particular webinar as it relates to faith-based organizations. So we have a couple of different data sets, but effectively, when we look at the data from our database of cases, hundreds of cases, we saw that in 377 of those cases, now different cases give us different insights. They might not all have all the data that we want, but in 377 of those cases that we were able to analyze, again, specific to faith-based institutions, the majority of these cases, again, these have made it all the way to legal filing, were adult to youth cases. Now, some of these may be historical, some of these more current. This is a little different than what we see in other industries, and I don't want to downplay the importance of youth to youth cases, because that's where we're seeing a trend upward across industries. But they are adult to youth cases, and 68% of those involved a single victim. So one perpetrator, one victim. But a third of them involved multiple victims. So you have kind of a different pattern there, right? We think it's perhaps a more predatory or serial type offense pattern. But the majority are that single victim, kind of similar to schools. Most of the cases involve some sort of physical contact. Some of the cases were exposing a child to pornography or other things that didn't involve contact necessarily, more sort of online type of stuff. But where churches were really hit hardest in their finances is that negligent supervision. So if you think back to that safety equation, where that exposure really lives is in that supervision. So the average of those payouts for that database of cases for faith-based organizations is over $300 million. So again, there's a range in that because some churches are huge, have multiple campuses. You may have an entire diocese, a Catholic diocese in that. So those numbers are going to skew higher, likely because of that. But depending on the size of your congregation, it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. So most of those cases, negligent supervision. And we're going to talk about some strategies for that in a bit. Okay. A little more on this. Oops, I'm sorry. There are also some differences in historical cases versus the more contemporary cases. So when we look at when the abuse allegedly occurred, the payouts tend to be higher the older the case. So not as significantly in a faith-based industry. We see some that there are huge differences, but still 53 million is still a lot of money for any congregation. And so when we look at sort of when someone comes forward, again, that moment of how do we manage that? Historically, a lot of organizations did not do that well. In the absence of standards and best practices, and frankly, in the ignorance of trauma-informed response, we just didn't understand well back then how to do that well. We know better now. We know so much better now. A lot of that is because of the Me Too movement and all the work that's been done to understand the survivor experience. So hopefully we're getting better at this. Just a little more on the different exposures across those different operations. So as I mentioned, negligent supervision, definitely the highest. And negligent hiring That's another area where we see a lot of litigation, a lot of exposures. So what that might look like, because you may be saying, well, we do background checks. We got to think about who has access to the people that we serve. So immediately we think, well, employees and certain types of volunteers. But we've seen where it's easy to kind of drift from that. So there may be people who have access to your youth or to vulnerable adults that you serve as contractors or as visiting people. I've got a case I'm going to talk to you about in a second that I think is a good example of that. Um, but who is kind of coming in and out? Who has access to your people? And that's a lot broader than I think most people realize. So I'll tell you one anecdote, one terrible story actually. But we worked with a church a few years ago where they had a lady who was fully screened as a volunteer and helped out in the nursery. And so every Sunday she would work that 9 to 10:30 sermon time. And but her husband, who was not screened and vetted as a volunteer, would sit with her and wait with her in the nursery because he was her ride. They came to church together. Unfortunately, he ended up sexually abusing one of the kids in the nursery program, in the nursery ministry. Um, and turns out he was a registered sex offender. And so at that point, the church looked pretty indefensible because even though he wasn't officially a volunteer, he still had access to those little kids. So we got to think bigger about who has access. There may be people less formally involved in church, and just bring them on as a volunteer. Get them in the zone to where we understand who's in the room and who's been screened and who's been trained. Negligent retention. What this is keeping someone longer than perhaps you should have. So someone who may have exhibited red flags, inappropriate behaviors, sometimes even people who've been accused of abuse, keeping them on staff thinking, you know what, we don't think this is going to be a problem again, or we're going to move them to this different ministry or this different campus. But keeping someone who's a known risk has also caused some big payouts. And then general negligence, and that's kind of a catch-all for everything else. But you know, again, it gets back to who is supposed to be, who's in charge, who's supposed to be watching these kids, who's supposed to be making sure that my child is safe in this program. So there are a lot of huge cases out there with major payouts. So I'm sure you've seen headlines in the Catholic Church, in Episcopal dioceses, and in some of the, you know, the larger congregations, the more sort of hierarchical denominations, where you see these huge payouts, millions, and some Catholic dioceses are even in the billions at this point. Many of them have declared bankruptcy. Um, but again, it's very proportionate to the individual church. And I just wanted to share a couple of stories, things that are frankly in the media that we can talk about here as you know, these unfold. I get an alert every day in my inbox about sexual abuse cases in churches, and you know, it's a full email every day. There are so many cases happening. Again, I think survivors are more likely to come forward now, which is a gift, something we need to be grateful for. Um, we know parents are savvier now, which is great. They're asking more questions. They're raising concerns, and even youths are savvier now and may feel more empowered to say something. Now, again, we can't leave it all on them to come forward. We've got to make sure we're watching out for them as well. But we've seen churches who have really bungled that moment when someone comes forward. Um, I'm in the North Texas area, And there's a very large mega church here, and this was all over the news. Gateway Church in Southlake, Texas. It's very big, charismatic, non-denominational church, a mega church, if you will. And the founder, who is very dynamic, who had a huge following up this way, he was accused of sexually abusing a minor about 30 years ago. She had come forward to the church in the past and had effectively been ignored. So she ended up going to the media, and the church responded to this media blitz by saying, yes, our pastor, our founder, had an inappropriate relationship with a young lady. And he worked through it, and his wife supports him, and his wife loves him, and it's all going to be okay. He is forgiven. As the media dug in more, that young lady was 12 years old when that happened. And that church has been through a huge investigation now, an external investigation. The state of Texas is changing legislation because of this case. And the founder has been disgraced. His children, who are also pastors in the church, have been disgraced. They've probably lost half of their congregation. And it's not clear whether or not that church is going to survive. So it's unfortunately a exhibit A of how not to handle a situation like that. It's that sort of leaning into the things that make churches so great, and that redemption, and how do we move forward here at the expense of the survivor, right? And that's the lesson that churches are continually having to learn. There was another case out of Kentucky where another big church, the youth minister, the head youth pastor, had a friendship with a very high profile Christian musician. And this musician had won many awards in that industry. And because he was a friend of the youth pastor, he regularly came to that church to worship and to play with the band and to do work with the youth, and to mentor aspiring musicians in that church. And this is true in other churches too. But it turns out that this man, again, not a staff member, not a volunteer, but someone who had access to youth in that youth ministry, was grooming adolescent boys, making it normal to have massages at retreats. Everybody lets massage each other, inviting them over at sleepovers for his house. And of course, they thought it was awesome. Here's this guy who's a well-recognized and respected musician, that he was effectively grooming youths. And so, huge investigation. It was all very public. It's done a lot of damage to that church and that church community. But it's just another example of someone who's got access and, unfortunately used that power and that influence to exploit and abuse young boys. There are many cases out there with huge jury awards. Again, some of those large price tags are in those more hierarchical churches that frankly have deeper pockets, but they just keep coming. A smaller church that is one of the cases that we reviewed, 25 million in negligence. They had a Sunday school teacher who would, and I apologize, I know this is hard to hear, who would put candy in his pockets of his pants and have kids get the candy out of his pants in such a way that he found sexually gratifying. And of course, these are little kids that just, didn't understand what was happening. And so this went on for a very long time. And, $25 million later, and it's a wonder, you have to ask yourself again, that negligent supervision, did anyone notice him doing this? Who did anyone say, hey, let's not do that? Maybe that's not appropriate, right? In so many cases, when you go back to do an investigation, there are people who saw things and really regret not saying something. So again, thinking of that safety equation, if we can train people what to watch for, and give them the mechanisms to report that and feel safe reporting that, we're really going to talk about prevention. Okay. Unfortunately, I could go on and on about case studies. You don't have to look far to find these cases. But I don't want any of you to be that church where that happened, right? So that reputational risk is incalculable. We can talk all day long about what the price tag was, but that doesn't even begin to touch the reputational risk, and frankly, the risk to destroying someone's faith, right? I know y'all know this. I get very passionate about it. Okay, well, here's the good news. Here's the good news. Abuse is preventable. We know how to prevent this. And there are actionable steps that you can take to minimize this risk in your congregation. Again, safety equation. Under the safety equation, we have developed best practice standards. And so I'm going to give you some high level standards, practices in some of these areas. Some of these may be things you're already doing, which is great. And some of these are things that you have access to resources through the insurance board. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward too. So policies. I know we have a very large group on the call today. I'm curious how many of you have formalized your abuse prevention policies or your safe conduct policies. A lot of times when we start out with an organization, they say, oh, well, we've got that. And what they hand us is a sexual harassment policy. It's not the same thing, not the same thing. So what we would recommend in any policy is the big takeaway is defining boundaries. So we all come to church with a sense of what's appropriate and what's not. Unfortunately, we're not all on the same page. We all have different perspectives, different experiences, different cultures, all of those things. So it's really important to have an agreed upon covenant, if you will, or code of conduct to say, when we're all here together, these are the boundaries. And having that written down is very helpful for people to recognize when somebody falls out of that. So unfortunately, sometimes I see policies to say, they read more like an ethics policy. It's a, we will treat each other with respect and dignity and all those wonderful things. But saying specifically, it's not okay to give kids piggyback rides. It's not okay to text youths directly. It's not okay to be their friend on social media. Those are very observable things. And that's really what we've got to get down to. So clearly saying, here's what's prohibited. You can also couple that, though, with here's what is prohibited. Because we know sometimes people feel like, oh, we're just getting policy to death, and this makes it hard for me to do my job. What's okay, what's not okay. So let's give them some things that are okay. High fives, handshakes, elbows, fist bumps. We want people to show affection. It's not, we don't want to turn everyone into robots. And we certainly don't want to create a touch police state, right? We want people to have healthy boundaries and interactions with the people that they serve. So there should be some zero tolerance pieces. One of the things I see churches struggle with is it's easy to say you should never be alone with a youth, and that is ideal. But sometimes that's going to happen. So we need to make sure people know how to manage that in the moment if it does happen, right? So we've got to be realistic at the same time. We've also got to have policies that help us create institutional memory and make sure that we're handling situations consistently. You know, a lot of churches are run by their volunteers, and volunteers may or may not be in that position very long, and we're so grateful to them for their service. Um, so we've got to have consistency. So when people leave, we're all going to be doing this the same way. So we want to make sure that warning signs of inappropriate behavior are taken seriously. Again, we want to focus on prevention, not just responding to suspected abuse. We want people to know what to look for, and we're going to train them on that. But we've got to give them some clear instruction on what to do if you do have a concern. We're going to treat cases the same. We've got to be consistent. It's really easy for bias to creep in when we're talking about people in our congregation. Oh, I've known her for 30 years. She's been here. She's been our volunteer. That's Miss Louise. She wouldn't hurt anybody. Not to say that she would, but we want to make sure that if something is raised about her, we're not just writing it off because, oh, well, we know her. That's not a problem, right? So we don't want to minimize anyone's behavior. We don't want to excuse anyone's behavior. We want to handle that consistently, which sounds easy to do, but it's hard because we're human. It's important to communicate these policies effectively. So when you do have updated policies, it's really important to roll that out intentionally so that you can implement those in a long-term way. So, using email, social media, church meetings, bulletins, any way you have the opportunity to communicate, hey, we've got a youth retreat this weekend. Don't forget, here are the rules about communication. Here are the rules about how kids are supposed to be sleeping. That really empowers everyone to help keep everybody safe. Screening. This is an area, it didn't reflect it as much in our analysis of church cases, but this is an area where we see huge exposures in organizations. So background checks alone is not screening. Very important, very important. If you're not doing this, it's going to cost you dearly, unfortunately. And I know background checks aren't free and they're not necessarily cheap, but this is standard operating procedure 101. And it's really important to be able to talk about how you screen your folks if, heaven forbid, you're to have an incident. But we know that doing a background check, the likelihood of you finding something on that hit or a hit is really dependent on the fact that not a lot of people get caught. So we can't put all of our eggs in that basket. It's important for us to do that, and people do find things and eliminate volunteers from being a candidate for that ministry. But we can't put all our eggs in that basket. So, when you have someone that shows an interest, there's an opportunity to say, that's great. Hey, just so you know, we take abuse very seriously here, and we've got policies and we've got this code of conduct. From the beginning, that's the opportunity to tell someone that wants access to the people that you serve about what you do and why this is important. And so asking interview questions that assess behaviors, not just what would you do if you had a youth that was acting out? Saying, what have you done in the past when you've had youth that act out? Asking those sort of what we call behavioral-based questions. Our founder was a clinical psychologist. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior, right? And so I'm getting some insight into that person's maturity. Even if you have a youth volunteer, youth, it's hard to screen with a criminal background check, but having a conversation with the youth who wants to volunteer, say, hey, tell me about a time when, or how have you handled this? If they've had that opportunity, is really valuable. And same with references. So, let others chime in on their requisite maturity and their ability to have good boundaries with people in ministry. Again, other resources are available here as well. Train people. And I know you have access to resources through our partnership with the insurance board on this piece, but it's not enough just to train people on their role as a mandated reporter anymore. We want to give people the right content that's preventative and really incorporates everything we've been learning over the last 30 years. So we really want to understand that from the perspective of how we serve people in ministry. What are those risks? And it being easy to access and use is really important as well. Again, that sort of natural attrition we have with volunteers, it's nice to have something that's accessible on demand. Sometimes it's even more valuable though to do something in person, do some sort of blended learning. So, if you've had an online training, bringing people back together to say, tell us what you learned in that. How are you going to apply that in your ministry? And you want to be able to track this, just like you would with having people sign their policies and the code of conduct, and being able to document that folks have been screened properly. Create a formalized monitoring system. So this gets back to that monitoring and supervision piece where we saw major exposures for faith-based organizations. It's really important to think through what are our highest risk ministries, our highest risk situations. I'll throw some out there. Anything that's overnight. If you're doing retreats, if you're taking kids camping, if some churches still do lock-ins, things like that, anytime there's an overnight component, it's a very high risk situation. Not that you shouldn't do it, but there should be some special monitoring and supervision plan around that. So let's take a youth retreat, for example. What's high risk about this, right? So you have kids sleeping in the same room. Boundaries tend to get sloppy when we're on retreat because there may be a lot of sharing. There may be more intimacy in the general sense. And there might be just a little cozy, right? And they're away from their parents. You're off campus, so it feels like we're doing something different. So it's just higher risk, an important part of spiritual development, but having some special protocols around that. So what's the sleeping arrangement? How far apart do we need to put sleeping bags or whatever the sleeping arrangement is? If it's in a hotel, right? Every kid should have their own bed, for example. And how do we chaperone that sufficiently so that adults are available to help supervise and adults aren't alone with a group of kids? So how do we set the adults up for success as well? How do you document that? So again, kind of play it out. Heaven forbid if something happens on this retreat, how are you going to be able to go back and say, here's exactly what we did, and here's how we can prove that we followed our own protocols, right? And then making sure that somebody reviews that documentation. So did anything unusual happen? Anything we need to follow up on? Anything we need to follow up on with the parents? Just to make sure that you kind of close out that retreat for all of those safe conduct purposes. So it sounds like a lot, but it's really just thinking through what are the high risks and how are we going to mitigate that. One of the things that we know is that we train people and we train people and we train people and we tell them, if you see something, say something, right? And people get that. But then organizations are bewildered that no one said something if something happens, right? Why didn't anyone say anything? Why didn't you say anything? They even feel this way about the person that comes forward, right? So if someone comes forward to report abuse, to say, you know what, last summer at camp, I need to tell you about what happened to me last summer at camp. A very common response might not always come out of your mouth, hopefully, but is, why did you wait so long to say something? And there are very real reasons. We know that it's very hard. If we kind of look at it from the survivor's perspective, Um, the average age for someone to disclose that they were abused as a child is 52. Many people do not want their parents to know. They may not want their significant other to know. It's the most horrible thing that probably happened to them in their life. And so again, when a survivor comes forward, that moment is so precious, that we have to listen and we have to treat them compassionately and respectfully and pastorally. Um, but when we think about, um, staff, it's really frustrating to say, why didn't you say something? We could have probably prevented this. We know that there are very real barriers in place. There are a lot of perceived barriers in place, but there's a lot of research on this. And what the research tells us is there are really four main reasons. One is there's a fear that there would be an over response or an under response. So if I say something, this person, their life is over. Or, well, this person is high profile and has a lot of power and they're untouchable. So what's the point? No one's going to believe me. Um, so another one is fear of making a false allegation, that I don't feel like I have enough evidence to say something yet. I don't want to I wouldn't wish a false allegation on anyone. And actually, false allegations, purely fabricated allegations, are pretty rare. Usually it's one adult falsely accusing another adult, typically in a divorce process. Or you may see a child who is in the social service system, the child welfare system, which ironically, they're at higher risk than just about any youth, but they may say something, again, very rare, but that's where we tend to see it. But, again, it feels like I'm accusing you of something horrible to say, I think you're being inappropriate. And again, if we think about that spectrum, we want that lower level concern addressed before it gets to that horrible point where somebody's probably been harmed. So people are afraid that they don't have enough evidence. And again, there are laws that protect people that report in good faith. But even internally, if you have a low level concern, we want to make people feel safe saying something sooner rather than later. Some organizations have some cultural issues where people fear retaliation or other consequences. I don't know what's going to happen if I say this. I don't want to risk my job for that. That can be a very real barrier. What we often see too, though, is I'm not sure where to go with this. I don't know I don't know what to do with this. And so they may tell a colleague, and it becomes more of a gossip situation. Then let's address this potential concern. And it's really hard to kind of separate the person from the behavior. And that's kind of the cognitive leap that we need people to make, that me saying something about your behavior isn't a character assault on you. This is about that covenant that we've all agreed to and making sure that we're all operating within this same space. So we also see barriers culturally. There may be concerns depending on their immigration status. Someone may not feel comfortable saying something. Again, that sort of fear of retaliation. They may feel, people may feel that, again, the organization isn't going to handle that objectively. They're not going to handle it well. Or, sometimes what we actually recommend, because it's hard to get people to see something, say something, in your normal, again, this is more likely with staff. Hopefully there are opportunities with employees, but finding those opportunities to say, hey, how are things going? Is there any concerns on your heart right now? How can we make sure that, you feel safe working here? Asking the question, sometimes you get that response. We do risk assessments sometimes for organizations, and we'll come in and say, hey, tell me about your training, tell me about how things are going. And I know you learned about low-level concerns. What do you do with that? Have you ever had to do that? And we hear things from people, and when we go back to leadership, they say, "How did you get them to tell you that?" We say, "Well, we asked." So sometimes you've got to be proactive too. So I've thrown a lot at you here, but some critical questions to be thinking about. And again, you will get access to these slides. But do you have written policies that clearly define physical, emotional behavior, and electronic communication barriers? How are those distributed? Do parents know that? Right? Do the youths know that? If you're serving adults in their homes, you know, taking them communion or whatever that looks like, do they know that you're not supposed to sit on their bed with them? Are there things that are boundaries that you've established for those higher risk situations? Also think about who has access to the people you serve. So I gave some examples today of, you have a significant other of an established volunteer, you have a visiting musician, you have people coming in and out that you may not have considered before. So I really want to challenge you to open your eyes to that, because we are seeing more and more cases of those sort of auxiliary people who have access. Do you require staff and volunteers to complete prevention training? And does it include youth to youth abuse prevention? It didn't show up as much in our analysis that we did for this presentation, which kind of surprised me. But we definitely see it in schools. We see it in youth sports. We see it in other industries. And it may just be kind of a lag of what's being reported legally, but youth to youth cases are definitely on the rise. I don't know that it's happening more, but they're being reported more. So do not underestimate that risk. It's really important, particularly if you're traveling with youth. Again, those overnight activities, those are much higher risk for those sorts of incidents. And again, we know how to prevent that. There are ways, there are strategies that you can use to prevent that. And it really gets back to supervision. Do you have specific procedures for managing high-risk locations and ministries? What are your procedures for responding to those low-level concerns? Right? How do those get handled internally consistently? Do you know your state's mandated reporting obligations? I bet if you're in California, you do. There's been a lot of activity in California on that in the last few years. But again, we're really seeing more and more states skew toward all adults are required to report firsthand. And in my experience, that's just a good rule of thumb. If you have someone who's nervous about doing that, you can accompany them, but it needs to be that firsthand report. Do you have a plan for if someone comes forward to report abuse? How will you receive that person? How will you support that person? It's something that may have never happened in your church, but we want you to be prepared for that moment. So how do you receive them? How do you support them? How do you investigate that objectively? How do you ensure that it doesn't ever happen again? These are all going to be questions that you'll be asked. Really, this all gets back to creating a culture of safety. So, we can talk about standards and best practices all day, and we should. But if you don't have that culture to support those standards and those best practices, it's just not going to sustain. It's not going to be sustainable. So you can have museum quality policies. You can have the best training in the world. You can have a really solid screening process. But if people aren't internalizing that, if they're not bought into the mission of why you do this, again, it's not really going to be implemented. So the risk that it becomes a compliance activity can be high. I'll talk about that in my next slide. But when we talk about a culture of safety, what does that look like? And we would point to these things, that Standards are clear. People get what they're supposed to do. People get what they're not supposed to do. You don't have to figure it out. If you're not sure, you can talk to someone. Standards are enforced. Again, being consistent, whatever the situation is. Everyone knows safety is part of their job. So I think it's real easy to say, well, that's the youth people. They've got to worry about that. No, we all have a role. We all have a role at church in keeping everybody safe. People take warning signs seriously. This one's tough. Same with the next one. Everyone reports their concerns. Those are very difficult for those reasons that I talked about, those barriers that people have. And we want to make sure that we're creating an environment where people feel safe, that they're gonna sleep better at night knowing that they said something rather than waiting to get that stack of evidence. Employee engagement is high and quality is institutionalized. So again, that sort of that administrative practices feature that I talked about in the safety equation, that all ministries are going to have those minimum standards, regardless of what campus you're on, what's going on. They should look the same in a lot of ways because we've got those core standards. Okay. As we're wrapping up here, I just want to keep in mind, I just mentioned about compliance. Many of the organizations that we work with, churches that we work with, schools, what have you, are somewhere on this spectrum. We call it the 3 C's at Presidium. On one end, we have complacency, where we think this has never happened here. We know our people. This is not going to happen here. And we're good. We're good. We don't have to worry about that here. We are strong. And we had that one problem in the past, but we fired that person. So that's done. Unfortunately, when you don't look at that larger systems approach, you're at risk for it happening again, right? So those checks and balances that are in place are there for a reason. So we would consider that ignorance, that we think it won't happen here. Perhaps even more dangerous, though, is the notion of compliance, which can be prideful to say, we do the mandated reporter training and we do a background check. So we're good. And it feels good to be able to say we do those things, right? And those are things you should do. But if you're not doing that in that context of a larger culture of safety, it's not really being implemented. So if it's just a matter of checking those boxes, and not really incorporating that, we're not getting very far. I had a monk, the head of a Catholic abbey is called an abbot, but he said, we are complacent because all we care about is compliance. That was pretty insightful. The goal is really to get to this place of commitment. And this is really where the culture of safety lives, where you have strong leadership that is committed to this, who's willing to dedicate resources to managing this risk. A committed church uses that systems approach, and isn't content to just say, well, we did all our background checks. They want to say, what's next? What can we continue to improve? What can we continue to do better? And even saying, we don't have all the answers internally. What do we need to pull from? What expertise do we want to make sure that we're tapped into so that we're on the cutting edge and this does not happen here? And that's really the place we work with organizations to get to. You all are very lucky because through the insurance board, there are many resources available, and Chad, certainly chime in here if you want to add to this, you might as part of our wrap up, but online training is available. Presidium developed online training is available. Also, in-person training, there's some options for that. That's the Creating a Safe Environment or CASE program. There's also an assessment tool and tip of the month, all kinds of resources available, some model policies, and even a subsidy for background screening, which is pretty exceptional. So I just want to remind you of that and encourage you to use those because they are there for you.
Hello, Christy.
Yes, Chad, did you want to chime in on that?
No, I think we've had some questions about it, so I think this is a great area, and we are very excited how we partner with Presidium. And all these things are available to everyone in our denominations that we serve through Insurance Board, whether you're a participant or non-participant, which when I got here about a year ago, I thought that was always really, really neat. That we're providing these resources pretty much for the most part free of charge or as subsidies for the background. To everybody online because we do believe in the work that's here and what we have to do to really protect our youth and our vulnerable adults. So all these are here. We will send when we have the email that goes out that says that this recording is done. We'll have a link that goes into our website, but you can go out on our website and that link will be there and you'll be able to download those if you're not already partaking in these great resources.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
And then my last slide is just a shameless plug for Presidium's Impact Summit later this fall, but I'll let you take a look at that on your own time. But we gather experts and stakeholders together to continue to advance this topic, and would love to see any of y'all there.
Excellent. Christy, thank you very much. That was very informative. Excellent information. We do have some questions. We're trying to get through them as best we can. So thank you for all you that have been putting the questions in. We're going to try to hit as many as we possibly can. If there's any that we do not answer for you, feel free to give me an email at ccunningham@insuranceboard.org. So it's CCUNNINGHAM at insuranceboard.org, and I will get those answers for you. We want to keep respectful of everybody's time, but I'd like to take about 10 minutes or so and ask a couple questions. The first question that came to us that I would like for you to answer live is negligent supervision a lesser included charge that may involve others more serious criminal conduct? So the negligent supervision, when we're looking at our culpable mental states, trying to give you, is a lesser of those mental states when we look at it, crime. But is that negligent supervision a lesser included charge that could go along with more serious criminal conduct charges?
Good question. So the negligence that we refer to, these are civil cases, not criminal cases. Anecdotally, we are seeing more people being charged criminally than we have in the past. I don't have good data on that, but the cases I was referring to in my presentation were all civil cases.
Okay, excellent. And from the criminal world, my background a little bit in the criminal world, on the good side, not the orange suit side for everybody's wondering. In law enforcement, we look at those. It could be another one that could come in more so, I think, on the civil, as you said, Christy, but they could possibly use it in the criminal. But again, it's really dependent on what the crime is and where it goes. But good. Would love to hear an example of a behavioral-based question. So you were talking about questions in there.
Yep.
Would you happen to have one off the top of your head?
Sure. So let me see. It's really how you word it. So a non-behavioral based question would start with, what would you do if? So what would you do if you had a youth that was really acting out and behaving badly? To turn that into a behaviorally based question, we would say, tell me about a time you had to deal with a youth who was really acting up. That's going to give you more insight into how that person would actually handle that. than them being prepared for, well, let me tell you the perfect response because I want to tell you what I want to hear because this is an interview. And that's normal. That's normal. But it's something that we're seeing more common in just normal employment practices. It's really getting more insight into that, how that person has handled things in the past rather than how they would ideally.
Excellent. And again, Google's always our friend.
Yes.
Very much Google
Yes.
and what those are and come up and use those quite often in interviews. Excellent. So here's one. Could something be said about middle school students, inappropriate touching, and how to work with both the victim, we're going to say survivor, and the person who did the touching in the same group? So I know we have an online component about youth on youth, but can you just very quickly, do you have any information on that?
Well, it's a good question, and I'd love to learn more about if it's a particular situation that you're working through. But obviously, when you have two youths involved, we want the person who's been harmed to feel safe. We want to be pastoral to them first and foremost, but we also want to be pastoral to the student, the youth that has acted out. So it's kind of a matter of understanding the risk that young person presents. So, there may be a moment, and it's not a comfortable moment, particularly in youth ministry, to say, can we really serve this young person effectively? Are we capable of making sure that this person doesn't do this again? And there have been times when churches have had to say, we can't serve this person in our ministry, which is very, very hard to do. But are there ways that you can make sure that others are going to be safe and that it's not going to happen again? So we've seen churches, schools, require some counseling for that child. We've seen, though, it can get really ugly if parents are saying, I don't want that kid around. It's not an enviable position to be in. So it kind of depends on what happened and the nature of all of that. But we want to be pastoral to both sides, but keeping in mind what is the real risk of the young person who perpetrated, that sounds so criminal, but who the aggressor, if you will. Oops. Can y'all still hear me? Can you still
Yes.
hear me, Chad?
We lost you for a little bit, but we got you back.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I got a note that my connection wasn't stable, so make sure we're good.
Yep, we got you back. All right. Excellent. Next one is when you talk about duty to report, is it only, the question is kind of twofold. Is it only if you see it firsthand you should report, or how about if somebody comes to you, should you report also?
Yeah, both. It's actually unlikely you'll see something happen firsthand. That's pretty rare. You may have a youth disclose something to you, or you may have a suspicion generally, but you don't have to have observed it directly to report it. If you suspect abuse is happening in a child's life, that's enough.
Excellent. You were talking about documents, and one of the questions came up is retention of documents. Can you provide any guidance on how Presidium looks at that, how long they should retain these docs?
Good question. And I'm going to shamelessly defer to the attorneys on this one. Not an attorney. Yep. But they're kind of two schools of thought. These cases can have a long tail. So for a lot of those reasons we talked about, there are delayed disclosures. So having that documentation is really nice if someone comes forward in 12 years. But there are some attorneys would say you shouldn't keep things more than 7 years. So there's a little tension in that. But to be able to speak to your practices at that time is helpful. So I'm going to be a little agnostic on this one, and really defer you to legal counsel for that.
I think that's a good answer. And not only that, it's good to check with your legal counsel, but not only that, every state's kind of different too.
Yep.
all states have different requirements on needed based on what the content and the information in those files are also. So
Absolutely.
that was a good question. Good answer. So we talked a lot about youth today, and I know we talked about vulnerable adults also. Some of the questions is, what can we do with the vulnerable adults or some of the elder abuse characteristics that we may see within our environment also?
Mhm. Yeah, I think a lot of the concepts overlap, right? Those things about boundaries, those things about how you report concerns. Conceptually, there are a lot of the same things. When we look at how an adults in ministry, it's in some ways more complicated because people are even less likely to report those situations. They think, oh, well, that's a consenting adult, right? That's an adult. Um, but you may serve some very vulnerable populations. And elderly, we know that they can be abused in many ways and exploited in many ways. And I think, it's important to educate your ministry teams that are working with these populations to understand what those red flags are, because they're going to be different than those red flags that we would see with youth. But again, many states have an adult prevention services or adult hotlines to report adult abuse. So I would be just as vigilant about those things because they can be extremely vulnerable.
And I agree. And I think, like you said, a lot of them overlap. So the same concept, if we're having two adults with youth, yeah, maybe we should have two adults with vulnerable or elderly and vulnerable if we have
Mhm.
people, delivering to our shut-ins or anything like that,
Yes.
not to go along, because it's always better when you're with two. Agree?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Under compliance in your presentation, what are relays?
What are relays?
And I'm thinking, I was looking,
I'm
but
going to look at my slide here.
I was trying to find where that is, but I could not find it. So we might have to come back.
Oh, it should be relies.
Got it.
You got
Thank
me.
you for calling the typo out there, individual. No, I missed it too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Um, so question, we talk about a lot of the do's and don'ts you talked about. How about where's the line drawn if a child gets injured? As little as a paper cut or a small cut that needs a Band-Aid. You know, do we provide them the Band-Aid? How do we look at those aspects? Because we're going to get that. We're going to get that
Yeah.
on both sides. How does that Presidium?
Yeah.
How do you guys provide that guidance?
Yes. Give them a Band-Aid. If you have an emergency situation, do what you need to do. But that's a good example of you just want to document that to say, I was by myself and ended up having to do this and just document that. That's one of those kind of unusual situations. That way, if heaven forbid something were to come back, you documented that in the moment to say, here's how I handled that. That's better than coming back to say, whoa, 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 what are you saying that I did? So just document that. By all means, give that child medical care if they need it.
Excellent. And we got time for one more, so I'm kind of trying to scroll down through here. Trying to see if there's one more that can hit a lot of their individuals. So I got a lot of questions. I think we'll end on this one. On, do I need a Presidium account to use the resources that we provide? And the answer is yes. You have to. So if you go on our line at insuranceboard.org and under Safety Central, you select Safety Central, kind of hover it and go down to abuse prevention. You'll go on our abuse prevention page and you'll see towards the bottom, it explains all the different services that we're providing through Presidium with our partnership, and you'll have a sign up towards the bottom of that page. Once you go in to select to sign up, you'll need to have your IBID number, which you can find on your MOI, and then fill out information on who can sign contracts and who has all those who wants to be the administrator. And on page 4, then you can go in and select exactly what you want. Do you need to sign up for screening? Do you need to sign up for the academy? Are you wanting the assessment? You want case, which is that one-to-many approach. We consider it the face-to-face. So you can sign up everything there. And then within 7 days or so, you'll get an email that says, this has been set up for you, and you may go forth and learn. Did I miss anything on that one, Christy?
I think you're
Okay.
good. I mean, once you get to that landing page, it'll really walk you through. We've just got to get you set up in those different platforms, and with background checks, legally there has to be a contract process. So I know it's a little tedious, but it's definitely worth it.
And even if we have some folks on here who are not participants through Insurance Board, it doesn't matter as long as you're within the denominations that we serve. You still have access to all that information free, except for the subsidy within the background checks. So again, it's all out there on our website, and you can sign up for it. So I know we didn't get to everybody's questions. I do apologize, but if you'd like to get those questions over to me, I will get those answered for you within as quickly as I possibly can. I know there were some questions about lists of questions for interviewing that we may want to ask when it deals with abuse prevention and SML, and we'll get a list together, and that will be there with our presentation that Chrissy's going to share with us, and it will all be there with the recording on our online learning website. So again, Christy, thank you very much for your time and expertise and professionalism. Great class, and we just appreciate everything you do for our participants.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, and I appreciate everyone's time. I know this is a tough topic, and we've been here a while, so thanks for sticking with us, and just let us know how we can continue to support you.
Excellent. And everyone else, thank you very much for attending. I'll look for that within the next week. And if you need anything else, please provide information to us. Thank you and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.